Hey gang, so after Invictus, the June sale is Alien Week. Unlike Invictus, there's usually big rumors and expectations around Alien Week, and typically those are overblown. Could this year be different though? Sure, let's get into it. So after Invictus, most people are kind of in that big sale mentality, and for whatever reason, they tend to keep that ball rolling for Alien Week. I guess it makes sense since Alien Week and Invictus were started up around the same time. I think the same year, actually, around 2019 or 2020. I think 2020. But every single year, there's rumors that there's going to be a big reveal at Alien Week, a big concept sale, something like that. And nearly every year, there isn't. So like the big sales, like where Invictus is a time where you can buy any military or combat ship, with that definition of combat ship, it stretched a lot, or IAE where you can buy any ship that CIG's ever concepted. At Alien Week, you can only buy the alien ships, and that does include Asperia, which is a human manufacturer that does human usable knockoffs of historically alien ships. So things like the Prowler, for example, or the Talon, or any of the Van Duel ships. But mostly it's just a chance to grab those alien ships that don't really pop up in other sales. So think things like the Prowler, the Defender, the Raelin, and yeah, the Banu Merchantman. Don't worry, I'll be coming back to those last two. There's always rumors there's going to be cool new ships, that all these older concept ships on the back burner, like that aforementioned Raelin and Merchantman, are going to drop imminently. And sometimes wild rumors like huge Xi'an carriers and cargo movers, they just take over the community. It almost never happens. Don't quote me on this, but I think the only concept ever actually launched on Alien Week was the Sulian. So if you like sales, maybe the Nox. But where was I? Yeah, if you like sales and concepts of the hot, new, sexy ship, Alien Week probably isn't the sale for you. Although it sure looks like we're getting a Prowler variant, and I'll get to that one in a second here too. What you can expect from Alien Week is all the Alien and Asperia ships for sale, and they usually have a bunch of skins for them. One of the things I personally look forward to, or used to, was Around the Verse or Inside Citizen or Star Citizen live show, typically with John Crew and maybe another dev or two, where they drop some information on alien ships that were or are in development. So lots of paints and some info, and usually that's pretty much it. And that's not nothing, particularly if you like an alien aesthetic, or you want to hear about a ship that's been in concept for over 10 years and was worked on for a while before they threw in the towel, and now they're going to release a bigger and better version, the guise of a ship that was concepted 5 years ago. But I'm not better. You can always pick up a Sentoki, for example, or a Prowler or any of the Van Duel ships. And there's a bonus that none of these ships are artificially limited. You don't have to win an F5 war to get one. So that's really what Alien Week is. It's usually not a sale where they drop a bunch of new concepts or surprises. Although this year there's obviously going to be a Prowler variant, so what the hell? Let's get into that. Granted, at the time of this recording, we've only had 2 sneak peeks in the weekly newsletter to go off of. But as someone that's had a Prowler since the concept sale, I can confirm that it's definitely built off the Prowler chassis. So a wee bit of history on the Prowler. It's a Tavaran replica made by the human company Asperia. Lore-wise, despite being fairly large, they were supposed to have an incredibly small signature. So think something like the Saber that's in game right now. Basically, they could come up and disgorge their Tavaran assault troops into a human warship, and the first clue the warship would have was that those same Tavaran assault troops would now be wandering the quarters of the warship, ganking them. So pretty scary stuff. Of course, the Prowler in-game has kind of gone a different direction over the years. When it first dropped, CIG whiffed its maneuverability, so to gain that huge stealth buff, the Prowler had comparatively small engines for a small signature, but also low acceleration. It wasn't a fighter. The thing that dropped into our hands handled more like the Saber, which was the meta at the time in the game. And that's as opposed to an aging alien stealth dropship. But according to those who sniff the data, the Prowler and presumably this new concept variant are getting a few buffs this next patch, mainly in the form of more nose armor and weirdly better maneuverability. Again, for a hot minute there, the Prowler was the meta fighter in the game, and these buffs might bring it back into that category, at least until CIG nerfs it back down, probably by over-nerfing it, and then having to do a course correction later to bring it back up to normal. Really, okay, I'm going to go on a brief tangent here, but I feel it's warranted due to some of the comments that always pop up on my channel during these sales. CIG has to make these ships viable right now, even if it's not how they're going to be viable in the future. The Prowler is a perfect example of that. Really, all the dropships are. Eventually, dropships will be pretty heavily armored and probably slow to make up for that for the most part, able to tank incoming fire, drop off their troops, and get away without getting blowed up. For the Prowler, its armor will be stealth. This is true for a lot of the combat ships. What they'll eventually be isn't what's in the game yet, because some feature like armor or true stealth isn't in the game yet, at least not in the form they want it to be. So back to the Prowler, it's supposed to have these ground effect things, these sort of gravlev drives that's very similar if you ever saw the Matrix Reloaded with the Nebuchadnezzar. It has those, so it can actually coast along the ground or across a ship with those. Not in the game right now, and probably won't be for a while. So until that time, until these things are in the game, they still have to make these things playable in the game as it is. So they're mostly stuck wildly tweaking this or that to try to make these ships at least usable. So am I giving them too much credit? I mean, probably, but I also think people saying that CIG just does this to bump up sales are probably wearing a tinfoil hat that's a hair too tight. It doesn't explain why they tweak ships that don't become the meta and just kind of float in the middle like the Hornet or something like the Raft. And I fully expect that balancing act to go on and on long after these ships have been in the game for a decade or more. One ship will be the new hotness, and CIG will have to reel it in so it doesn't become the only ship people use, typically for combat. That's just game development. It's just that new ships are a little bit more of an unknown quantity. And to go into more detail on that, it's not like CIG is testing these ships for months and months before giving them to us. They get through the gray box, get that ship polished up, and kick it out the door as fast as possible. They leave the testing to us in this alpha environment, and then they look at the numbers, and then they say, yeah, that's about right, or more often, oops. And yeah, it does seem like the oops parts tend to be a little bit more in the new ship's favor than against it. But again, they want the thing to be viable. Or maybe that's just copium on my part. Anyway, speaking of the new hotness, there's this thing. It came with hints in the weekly newsletter of I've got my eyes on you and reborn with a purpose. And it's clearly a Prowler chassis, at least. The reborn with a purpose bit is probably a reference to Asperia remaking a Tavaran ship from the Human Tavaran War, which, another quick aside here, I've been saying for a while that I was shocked that the Tavaran weren't the first aliens they made. Tavaran are the alien race that was conquered by humanity and are actually now part of the Empire, serving in the government and the military. It just seems like, while you wouldn't see them everywhere, you should be seeing some of them, even if they're just homeless Tavaran in Area 18 or Lorville, or Tavaran graffiti. I mean, something. Maybe they'll get the devs on to talk about that. We know they got Manu working thanks to Wicklow. Vandul, obviously thanks to Squadron 42, are pretty far along. And we know they worked on GN facial animations for Squadron 42. And there's some involvement of the GN in that game too, but I'll come back to that in a second. Anyways, while the Tavaran have been absent in the game, we'll now have examples of 4 of their ships: the Talon, the Shrike, the Prowler, and this thing. My guess is that it'll be a hunter ship, especially the second picture seems to click with our quantum interdictors that are in the game right now. And given the shape and internals of the Prowler, a Slave 1 kind of bounty hunting ship actually would make some sense. Maybe with actual living quarters inside. And yeah, I've heard the rumor of an Atlas carrying dropship, but I'm not seeing it, and it wouldn't make a lot of sense lore-wise. Why would the Tavaran have made an industrial walker carrying dropship while they're at war with humanity? And it's not really the kind of ship that Asperia would make. Of course, CIG's done weirder stuff, so who could say? Let's push on to Dark Horses. And these are 2 ships we hear are dropping for Alien Week pretty much every year for at least the last 3 years. Notably, neither of these ships is in the game yet. So yeah, big grain of salt. So first, okay, let's start with the Merchantman. And yeah, I know I go to this well a lot. This one's rough for me, especially with the Polaris and Idris dropping and the Kraken working its way into production shortly. And presumably hot on the Kraken seals will be the Privateer, which can basically do all the stuff the Merchantman can do, but bigger and better. Added to that, the Kraken will probably eat up most of next year's development on big ships, along with the Pioneer, if not 2 years, and then the Privateer will probably eat up at least another year after that. So it's looking like, at best, the Merchantman is probably 3 to 4 years off. That would mean it would have been in concept for nearly 20 years. That's the grim, maybe pessimistic look, but I also feel that unless CIG starts busting out big ships way faster or hires way more shipbuilding devs, it's probably the most realistic with the information we have right now. So that's a bitter pill to swallow, if I'm being honest, but it's also one I understand. Every time I pull the 600i, I quickly remind myself what CIG can do if they don't really know what they're trying to build. While the Merchantman made it a good ways into Greybox, I get the sense that John Crew is becoming less enamored with some of the directions the ship was taking. And yeah, I know CIG has largely blamed the pin in the Merchantman's production on the loss of Paul Jones bouncing off to Ubisoft. And I believe Corten Billamont, I think I'm pronouncing his name right, he was the guy that coined the word tonk as a moniker, sort of unintentionally, but we loved him. He's gone too. So do I buy that story that those 2 guys leaving was why they stopped producing the Merchantman? Yes and no. Honestly, I just think the Merchantman is a really, really, really complicated beast. Each one was, in theory, unique, and they were all family ships that would be handed down for generations. The Banu are a very weird but very old spacefaring race, and CIG hasn't really had to model that age into any of their ships. Even the ancient ships and game lore like the Idris, Perseus, Nautilus, and so on are still in production and are being updated. So it makes sense you'd get one of those that's clean and relatively new. With a Merchantman, that's probably not the case. How do you capture something like that? Or more specifically, how do you capture something like that in a massively multiplayer game where there might be hundreds or thousands of these things? Maybe tens of thousands, since it was as cheap as a Connie for a while there. They're works of art. They need to feel unique. And CIG has said as much. John Crew has said as much. And going back to the 600i thing, where CIG really didn't have a handle on what luxury meant in a ship at that point in production, they eventually learned by making other ships. By the time they got to the 400i, they pretty much had it down. It's an aesthetically pleasing or awe-inspiring use of space. It's notably not having a crew quarters with zero privacy, but a huge ballroom in the center. And so they have to rework the 600i now. Now imagine that, but the 600 is the size of an Idris and alien. Truly alien. Yeah, kind of bakes in why they need to get this thing right the first time out. Personally, I think CIG should go a semi-modular route, have a few rooms on the Merchantman that are bespoke, like, say, the mall, the cargo room, the negotiation room, the bridge, but then allow the players to select from, say, 3 layouts for the rest of the ship. And then they'd have various modular rooms the player can select for the purpose of the rooms in that layout. Then you could have it so very few merchantmen would be the same on the interior beyond those bespoke areas. So is that complicated? Yeah, but we've already seen this on a lesser scale with the 300 series rework. So we know it's at least possible. Of course, then you'd have to make all those rooms and layouts, but CIG really wants to capture that unique nature. That would be a surefire way to do it. Maybe have an option for weathering on the inside too, or decorations. Again, this is something that is already piloted on the 300 rework.
To magic tech people to sprinkle the magic dust on interior OCs and brushes and everything else.
Like I say, that's another thing we want to do is like customizing interiors. We tried it in a very obtuse way with the 300 series, letting you customize the interior when in fact that is actually you're just customizing the dashboard and it changes trims in the back because they're part of the dashboard. So we can do it. It's not a great way to do it, and it absolutely doesn't scale across larger ships.
And we've tried it like internally with using our tint system within our editor, but all it does is it just gives us another version of everything, like the entire ship, and it's not able to kind of do that in the client and in game. So yeah, we can prototype this stuff, but we don't have an ability to actually put that in the live product, which is a shame because I think it was the Star Lifter we were playing with, and we started making the different variants, and it was like, oh, this looks really cool in dark gray on the inside, but it just doubles up the entire everything we need for the ship gets doubled, and that does not scale when we're trying to do hundreds and thousands of ships. It's just never going to happen, unfortunately.
The RSI Galaxy is a multi-role vessel with true modularity that has different sections of the middle of the ship that can be changed out to support significant and real gameplay loops.
Additionally, I think, and a lot of people think, that CIG will need to release some mid-sized Banu ship, something between the size of a Connie and a Starfarer. I came up with the sloop idea and even worked it up in low poly. But this line of thinking is hardly unique. Other community members have had ideas for, say, a Banu Clipper, which was pitched by Ruadhan, I'm not sure if I'm saying that name right, as being a RAF-like ship. And more recently, the Banu Trip Taker, which was actually mentioned in lore and might be on display in Wikilos Museum in an Easter egg that was spotted by Hare on Spectrum. So the idea is out there, and it might be what the Merchantman needs. They need to decide what the Banu really are, like they did with the Xi'an, what their aesthetic is, what their design language is, how they think, and so on. And that's easier to explore in a slightly smaller ship. So yeah, am I disappointed that I'm not trucking around in my BMM right now? Sure. But there were parts they were showing off that didn't quite click right with me and felt very 600 IE, if you catch my drift. So if they take a little more time and nail it down, that's probably for the best. Especially if I get a Kraken or Privateer as a loaner. But are we getting the BMM this Alien Week? Hell no, but hopefully we do get some sort of update, something with a bit more substance than we put a pin in it, or it's not currently being worked on. Finally, I'll leave it with John Crew himself. He talks about why it was put on ice here, pretty much echoing what I just said.
So in the next year, backlog ships that will be going into production, caveat, things can always
Yeah.
change.
Yeah.
Polaris, Apollo, G12, Raylan, X1s.
I'm noticing something conspicuously absent.
Don't know what you're talking about.
Band new.
So we'll talk about the merchantman briefly, because we discussed like how we want to do the backlog of capital ships. So we want to start with RSI, because doing the Polaris first helps reduce the amount of work needed for the Perseus and the Galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
So those three will likely be like a chain of dependencies from each other.
Kind of shared assets.
Yeah, there's a lot of shared assets between them. Obviously, the exteriors are like, quite different, but you do an RSI hall kit or corridor kit, floor kit, doors, beds.
chairs.
Yeah, it all gets reused across them, maybe with some slight material differences. So there are a few things that were problematic with the BMM. Firstly, everything is unique.
Everything.
So it's not like we do one corridor kit.
It can't be modular.
Yeah, it
It's
can't
so
be
many
modular. It has to
bespoke
be
shapes.
unique.
Yeah.
Nothing on the ship can be modular.
Yeah.
Every corridor, every room.
Everything's unique. So the amount of time investment.
I mean, there's some chairs, but even then, some of the chairs we couldn't reuse because of the shaping of the rooms.
So like molded something.
Yeah.
Right. There's
So like
lots of bespoke
everything. It
geometry.
was.
So yeah, we had a lot of people on there. We had some unfortunate people leaving, which they've been here quite a while, so we'd lost a lot of sort of that team knowledge and part of rebuilding the team. Obviously, effectively, again, like we said, you don't get new staff members go, hey, welcome to the Banu Merchantman. Here's a completely bespoke thing that does not follow any of our existing art guidelines.
Yep.
And all the time we would have put into that would be just for that ship.
Mm-hmm.
We get no reuse from it. So yes, we will do it again, but personally, I think the time is better spent on other capital ships to get people up to speed, and then we can start putting people back on it.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of love within the team for the merchantman. I think it's
Except for the picture Mark took of it.
Yeah, apart from
The
Mark's
FOV on that.
I'm never going to hear the end of that, am I?
No.
No. Okay.
Okay, so that's enough about the Dark Horse. I'm about 90% sure isn't coming. Let's talk about one that actually might not be too far off, and that's the Gatak Railin. Now, personally, I don't think the Railin is actually dropping this Alien Week, but I wouldn't be shocked if CIG dropped that it's actually in production. We know for a fact they were working on it as little as a year ago, and we know the gray box, like the Merchantman, made it a pretty good distance. We haven't heard much since, but also like the Merchantman, it felt like they needed an intermediate ship to kind of get a feel for who the Xi'an were as a species. And then we got the Sulian. And we know the Xi'an have a presence in Squadron 42. Now, CIG hasn't said what kind of presence that'll be, but we've at least seen a Cartual in the trailer. And it wouldn't be completely beyond the pale that the Xi'an would have a larger ship operating in the Odin system, which is a good, I think, 2 or 3 jumps past the Perry line, which is the border with Xi'an space. That would suggest something a bit larger than the Cartu or Santok. At the moment, that leaves the Raelin, but granted, Banu Slavers were in the vertical slice from a few years back, so Merchantman would have made sense too, but I'm not bitter. Anyways, Raelin. We know they've done a lot of work on it, and unlike the Merchantman, we know they now have a decent handle on the Xi'an and their style guide. Bonus that the Xi'an ships aren't unique pieces of art, and unlike the Merchantman, are mass produced. So right here, I'll say that there's maybe a, let's say, 20% chance they drop the Raelin on us. But the chance they drop some info, like it's in production or targeting X date, well, that's far more likely. And I wouldn't be completely shocked if it drops before the end of the year or early next year. Maybe in time for Alien Week, or maybe with the launch of Squadron 42 itself. I think they might launch a few ships with that launch just to build up hype. And gang, that's all I got for this one. Let me know what you think below. Think I'm way off? Think I'm dead on? Think I smell? Let me know in the down below bits. Be safe out there and see you next time.